Very quickly, we figured out he's dead, and it turned into a bit of this is a crime scene to some degree. CSI crime scene wildlife.
Ian Bartosek was on a regularly scheduled tracking mission over the winter, equipped with these transmitters to find female Burmese pythons and their eggs taken out.
Before the mystery had a name, before anyone imagined that the Everglades might be hiding a predator capable of hunting one of the most feared snakes on Earth, the Burmese python ruled the swamp without challenge. For years, these enormous constrictors moved through the flooded wilderness as if nothing could stand against them. They swallowed deer whole, overpowered alligators, and stripped entire wetlands of wildlife. In the Everglades, they had become the undisputed apex predator. Nothing that swam, crawled, or walked through those waters was supposed to threaten them. Then something impossible began to happen. The biologists studying these giant snakes started losing them. At first, it seemed like nothing more than a technical problem. One radio signal disappeared, then another, then another. Every time a transmitter stopped showing movement, researchers traveled into the swamp expecting to recover a dead python or a damaged tracking device. But before we follow those signals into the Everglades, take a moment to subscribe. Every week, we uncover remarkable true stories where science, history, and nature reveal mysteries that seem almost impossible. If you enjoy documentaries that keep you guessing until the very end, you're in the right place. Now, back to the swamp. Instead, the researchers found something far stranger. There was never a carcass, no blood stained the mud, no drag marks crossed the marsh, no shed skin floated in the water. The swamp looked untouched, as though nothing unusual had happened at all. Only one thing remained. The implanted transmitter continued sending its signal with perfect precision, its electronic pulse echoing through the wilderness every few seconds from somewhere inside an animal that had swallowed an apex predator whole before vanishing back into the black water. For a long time, nobody knew what that animal was. Then, one day, a remote camera finally captured the answer. When the footage appeared on the screen, an entire room filled with experienced biologists fell silent. To understand why that moment was so shocking, the story has to begin much earlier, with what everyone believed would be an ordinary scientific project. Ian Bartosek and his team at the Conservancy of Southwest Florida had launched what looked, at least on paper, like a routine field study. Working across the wetlands of the Picayune Strand and along the edges of Big Cypress National Preserve, they partnered with the Conservancy's Python team and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to learn more about the movements of invasive Burmese pythons. The process was slow, methodical, and anything but glamorous. Each captured python underwent surgery to receive a specially designed radio transmitter. Unlike simple tracking tags attached to the outside of an animal, these transmitters were implanted inside the snake's body, allowing them to broadcast reliable signals for months as the pythons traveled through miles of flooded wilderness. Every day produced another collection of data: movement corridors, hunting ranges, resting sites, survival patterns, the kind of careful scientific work that quietly fills databases instead of making headlines. At that point, nobody believed they were investigating a mystery. They thought they were studying the Everglades' most successful predator. That assumption mattered. In the Everglades, the Burmese python sat at the very top of the food chain. Everything else had learned to fear it. These snakes consumed alligators, swallowed deer whole, emptied wetlands of wildlife, and continued hunting as though nothing could stop them. Nothing in that ecosystem was supposed to prey upon an adult Burmese python. That was precisely why Bartosek's team was tracking them. They wanted to understand the monster, not discover what might be hunting it. The work itself was exhausting. Day after day, the researchers pushed through chest-high water beneath crushing Florida heat. Cypress roots grabbed at their boots with every step, while razor-sharp saw grass sliced exposed skin without warning. Still, they followed every radio signal. The transmitters were remarkably dependable. Designed to survive harsh conditions, they continued broadcasting regardless of where their host traveled. Because of that reliability, whenever a signal suddenly stopped moving, the researchers assumed the simplest explanation. Perhaps the battery had failed. Perhaps water had damaged the equipment. Equipment problems happen. What never crossed anyone's mind was that the snake itself had simply disappeared. Animals this large do not simply vanish. Then the signals began dying. Not because the transmitters had stopped working. That was the disturbing part. Every few seconds, each transmitter continued broadcasting its clean electronic pulse from exactly the same location. The equipment functioned perfectly. The pythons attached to that equipment were the things disappearing. Python 19 became the first unmistakable warning. For 3 weeks, its movements had been completely normal. The tracking data showed predictable activity windows, familiar travel routes, and regular periods of rest. Everything matched what the researchers expected from a healthy Burmese python moving through the Everglades. Then, without warning, the movement stopped. Not the slow stillness of a cold-blooded reptile resting on a cool morning. Not the quiet pause between hunting trips. This was absolute stillness, the kind that usually means only one thing. Something had happened. The team pushed through flooded grass, tangled cypress, and knee-deep mud until they reached the coordinates. As they approached the signal, every person slowed to a stop. The swamp looked untouched. No carcass, no blood, no drag marks, no shed skin. Nothing suggested that a struggle had taken place. Only one sound broke the silence. The faint, steady electronic pulse of the implanted transmitter continued broadcasting from somewhere nearby. They searched the surrounding water. They checked the brush. They inspected the nearby tree line. They followed the signal again and again. Still, they found nothing except the transmitter beeping quietly from the muck. It felt less like a wildlife study and more like arriving at a crime scene where the body had vanished. Only one conclusion made sense. Something had swallowed their python whole. The transmitter had gone with it, and whatever had done it was still somewhere in the Everglades, moving silently through the black water, digesting an apex predator as though it were just another meal. The researchers forced their way through flooded cypress groves, razor-edged sawgrass, and waist-deep water, until the coordinates finally brought them to the source of the signal. The moment they arrived, the entire team stopped. The swamp was silent. There was no carcass lying in the mud, no blood staining the water, no drag marks leading away from the scene, no shed skin caught in the brush. Every direction they looked appeared completely undisturbed, as though nothing had happened there at all. Only one thing broke the silence. The transmitter continued its steady electronic pulse. Somewhere beneath the surface, it was still broadcasting from inside another animal's stomach. The researchers spread out, searching every possible hiding place. They checked the water, combed through the brush, examined the nearby tree line, and repeatedly followed the signal to its exact location. Every search ended the same way. There was nothing. Nothing except the transmitter, quietly beeping from the muck below. It felt less like wildlife research and more like discovering a clue without the crime scene that should have surrounded it. Only one explanation fit the evidence. Something had swallowed their Burmese python whole, transmitter and all. Whatever had done it had never stopped moving. Somewhere in the Everglades, it was still alive, still traveling through the swamp, and still digesting one of the most feared predators in North America. To understand how unbelievable that was, you have to remember what a Burmese python really is. It is not prey. It is a massive, muscular constrictor that grows with astonishing speed. It is the animal other creatures avoid whenever possible. Yet something hidden in those wetlands had killed one so completely that an experienced research team, standing on the exact location where it happened, could not find a single visible trace of the attack. The swamp had become a crime scene without a body. Then the mystery grew even darker. By October of that same year, 2 more radio signals suddenly stopped moving. 2 more pythons had vanished. Again, there were no carcasses, no blood, no evidence of a struggle. Only 2 more transmitters patiently broadcasting from places where living snakes had existed only hours before. One disappearance might have been dismissed as an extraordinary accident. 3 could not. 3 different pythons. 3 implanted transmitters. 3 predators consumed by something nobody could identify. Whatever was responsible was still hunting in a swamp filled with researchers, cameras, and tracking equipment, yet not a single person had actually seen it. Running out of answers, the team gathered every piece of evidence they had and carried it back to the laboratory. There, they placed the recovered remains under X-ray machines. When the images appeared on the screen, the room fell completely silent. One member of the research team would later admit that the work had stopped feeling like biology and started feeling like a criminal investigation. Instead of studying living snakes, they were now investigating unexplained deaths. There was no suspect, no obvious weapon, not even a clear idea of what kind of predator they were searching for. The X-rays revealed an unsettling picture. A Burmese python's spine remained intact, curled neatly inside another animal's stomach. Beside it sat the surgical transmitter, still functioning perfectly, still sending its electronic heartbeat from deep inside a predator that nobody could name. One reconstructed case was especially difficult to comprehend. The python had weighed more than 50 pounds and stretched nearly 13 feet long. Its neck had been destroyed, and what remained of its body had been buried beneath vegetation after being consumed. Something had killed an apex predator of that size, swallowed it whole, and quietly slipped back into the water. Everything scientists knew about the Everglades said that should have been impossible. A 13-foot Burmese python was not supposed to be prey for anything living in that ecosystem. It was the animal that emptied wetlands of life. Yet something had treated it as nothing more than another meal. Years later, Bartoszek would describe that discovery as the most surreal moment of his 2 decades working in the Everglades. For 20 years he had studied every predator in those swamps. He knew their tracks, their bite marks, and the countless ways animals died in that environment. Yet now he found himself staring at an image that refused to fit anything he knew. The evidence quietly eliminated one possibility after another. Whatever had killed the python had not torn it apart. It had not left scattered remains behind for scavengers. Instead, it had swallowed the entire animal in one piece, bones, flesh, and implanted transmitter included, and had kept it inside long enough for digestion to begin. That was not the behavior of a scavenger. It was not an opportunistic attack. It was the work of a predator specifically built to swallow prey approaching its own size. And in Florida, the list of animals capable of doing something like that was almost non-existent. To understand how extraordinary this mystery had become, another story had to be remembered. The Burmese python had never belonged in Florida. Its true home lay thousands of miles away, across the steaming jungles and wetlands of Southeast Asia, through Myanmar, Thailand, and Vietnam. For millions of years, those ecosystems had shaped the snake's existence. Predators hunted it. Competitors challenged it. Diseases kept its numbers in balance. Generation after generation, an entire network of natural checks had evolved alongside the python, preventing it from dominating everything around it. None of those natural enemies crossed the ocean. Instead, during the exotic pet boom of the 1980s and 1990s, thousands of young Burmese pythons were shipped into the United States. They were inexpensive, beautifully patterned, and easy to sell. Most buyers saw only an unusual pet. Very few understood that the tiny snakes they carried home would eventually grow into enormous constrictors capable of reaching lengths few people were prepared to handle. As the years passed, the tiny snakes people had once carried home in glass tanks began to reveal what they had always been destined to become. They did not stay small. They grew 15 feet, 18 feet. Some stretched beyond 20. Suddenly, the harmless-looking pets became enormous constrictors that few owners could control and even fewer wanted to keep. Faced with an animal they had never truly understood, many made a decision that seemed simple in the moment but would change an entire ecosystem. Instead of finding a responsible solution, they drove to canals, marshes, and the edges of the Everglades. Then they opened the containers. One by one, the snakes disappeared into the wetlands. Those releases placed living weapons into a landscape that had no evolutionary memory of what a Burmese python was. Nothing in Florida had evolved alongside them. Nothing had spent thousands of years learning how to recognize or resist them. Then nature amplified the problem. In 1992, Hurricane Andrew tore across South Florida with devastating force. Among the destruction were commercial reptile breeding facilities. Their enclosures failed, and hundreds more Burmese pythons escaped into the wild in a single night. What had once been a slow trickle of released pets suddenly became a flood. The Everglades had never prepared for an invasion like this. The snakes arrived without natural predators waiting for them. No native species had evolved specifically to hunt them. No ecosystem had learned to keep them under control. Instead, the pythons entered the wetlands as nearly perfect killing machines and immediately began feeding. The consequences were staggering. Wildlife that had occupied the Everglades for thousands of years began disappearing with astonishing speed. In the regions most heavily affected, raccoon populations did not simply decline. They collapsed by 99.3%. Opossums suffered an equally devastating loss, dropping by 98.9%. Bobcat numbers fell by 87.5%. Marsh rabbits, muskrats, and cottontails virtually vanished from habitats they had occupied for countless generations. Adult white-tailed deer became meals swallowed whole. Even American alligators, armored reptiles whose ancestors had survived the mass extinction that ended the age of dinosaurs, were found inside python stomachs. Researchers also recovered the remains of dozens of bird species, including migratory birds that had flown all the way from Canada to spend the winter in Florida, only to become prey before making the return journey. Perhaps the most disturbing part was the speed. This transformation did not unfold over centuries. It happened within decades. In some areas, dramatic changes appeared in only a handful of years. After spending more than 20 years studying the invasion, University of Florida wildlife ecologist Dr. Frank Mazzotti estimated that the Everglades now held tens of thousands of Burmese pythons, and perhaps even hundreds of thousands. It was an invisible army, perfectly camouflaged, endlessly patient, quietly dismantling one of North America's most irreplaceable ecosystems from within. People refused to surrender without a fight. Federal authorities banned further imports and officially classified the Burmese python as injurious wildlife. Florida launched bounty programs to encourage removals. Detection dogs were trained to locate hidden snakes. Thermal drones swept over the endless sawgrass, looking for warm bodies concealed beneath the vegetation. Removal competitions drew experienced hunters from across the country. Scientists collected environmental DNA, deployed acoustic monitoring systems, conducted aerial thermal surveys, and coordinated efforts across numerous agencies. Even the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers became involved in the response. Every available tool was brought into the battle. Yet despite years of effort, enormous resources, and countless hours spent searching the wetlands, nothing changed the overall trajectory. The pythons remained, the invasion continued, and the Everglades kept losing ground. The longer scientists remained in the Everglades, the more one unsettling conclusion followed them from the field to the laboratory. No matter how cautiously they wrote it into research proposals or how bluntly they admitted it over cups of coffee after another exhausting day in the swamp, the conclusion never changed. The pythons were winning. Little by little, the Everglades was losing. After spending 3 weeks working in chest-deep water, Dr. Frank Mazzotti finally put the situation into words that no one on the team could dispute. Standing in the middle of the swamp, he said the ecosystem was being eaten alive, and there appeared to be no predator capable of stopping it. No one argued. The numbers spoke for themselves. Then everything changed. While most researchers were accepting defeat, Ian Bartosek noticed something happening on his tracking monitors that nobody had predicted. The transmitters were beginning to disappear, not because they had stopped working, because the pythons carrying them had vanished. When the evidence finally began to accumulate, it overturned nearly every assumption the researchers had built their work upon. Something was swallowing apex predators whole. It left no blood, no carcasses, no visible signs of violence. Then it disappeared back into the swamp, as though nothing had happened. That much was certain. Everything beyond that was guesswork. The team began testing one explanation after another. The first suspect seemed obvious: a giant American alligator. If any animal in the Everglades possessed the strength to challenge a Burmese python, surely it would be the swamp's other legendary predator. But the evidence refused to fit. Alligators crush their prey. They spin in violent death rolls. Their attacks leave shattered bones, torn flesh, and scattered remains spread across the surrounding area. None of those signs existed. The pythons had simply vanished. The researchers crossed the alligator off the list. Perhaps it was a Florida panther. Panthers were stealth hunters that ended fights with a crushing bite to the skull or spine. They left claw marks, puncture wounds, disturbed vegetation, and unmistakable evidence of their attacks. Again, the swamp offered nothing: no fur, no tracks, no scratches, no paw prints pressed into the mud. The panther theory quietly collapsed. Attention shifted to black bears. Florida's black bears were powerful, adaptable, and capable of eating an astonishing variety of prey. Yet even they could not explain the evidence. A bear could kill many animals. It could not swallow a 13-foot python whole. The mechanics simply did not work. One by one, every serious predator in the Everglades food web faced the same scrutiny. Large hawks, owls, other constrictor snakes. Each possibility was examined carefully. Each was eventually dismissed. Whatever predator they were searching for behaved in a way that none of their existing models could explain. With every theory exhausted, the team turned to the only witness that never grew tired: the cameras. Remote wildlife cameras were installed throughout the study area, positioned wherever another transmitter had mysteriously stopped moving. Then the waiting began. Days turned into weeks. Memory cards filled with footage that offered almost nothing. Saw grass swayed endlessly in the breeze. Wading birds searched quietly through shallow water. An occasional raccoon wandered across the frame before disappearing again. Hour after hour, the Everglades behaved exactly as it always had. Patient, silent, unwilling to reveal its secrets. The researchers replaced batteries, swapped memory cards, and spent countless evenings reviewing recordings. Still, they found nothing. Then, one ordinary morning, everything changed. A researcher opened another video file. Within seconds, the room fell completely silent. For a long time, nobody spoke. Every assumption they had made dissolved before their eyes. The predator was not an alligator. It was not a panther. It was not a bear. It was not a hawk. In fact, it was nothing anyone in the room had seriously considered. It was not even particularly large. The camera showed a thick, dark-bodied snake resting perfectly still among the damp leaf litter beside the water. Its heavy body blended so completely with the decaying vegetation that it seemed to disappear into the forest floor itself. It was the perfect ambush. The kind of predator a person could step over on a trail without ever realizing it was there. Then, without warning, it moved. The strike was explosive, precise, surgical. If you'd like, I can continue with the next section in the same cinematic story style, cover the cottonmouth reveal, and explain how the X-rays confirmed what the cameras captured. Instant. It locked onto a juvenile python before the prey had any idea what was. The room remained silent as the video continued to play. Everything happened so quickly that, at first, it almost seemed as though the camera had skipped a frame. There was no warning, no slow build-up, no dramatic chase. One instant, the predator lay perfectly still beneath a blanket of damp leaves at the water's edge. The next, it exploded forward with astonishing speed. The strike was over almost before the camera could fully capture it. One precise movement. One clean hit. Then complete control. As the researchers leaned closer to the screen, they finally saw the animal responsible. It was not some giant, undiscovered predator. It was a Florida cottonmouth, a venomous pit viper that had lived in those same wetlands for thousands of years. Every member of the research team had walked past animals like this countless times while working in the Everglades. They had stepped around them on trails, watched them slip quietly into the water, and rarely given them more than a passing glance. Yet here it was, hunting an invasive Burmese python, and swallowing it whole. The realization was almost impossible to process. One native snake was eating another. The overlooked predator, the one that had quietly shared the swamp with every other species long before the pythons ever arrived, had been fighting back all along. The camera continued recording. The cottonmouth showed no urgency. It worked with remarkable patience, slowly unhinging its jaws around the python's tail before beginning the deliberate process of swallowing it. Inch by inch, the prey disappeared. There was no frantic struggle, no violent thrashing, only a calm, mechanical sequence of movements performed with complete confidence. This was not an animal attempting something extraordinary. It was simply feeding. That detail struck the researchers harder than anything else they had witnessed. This was not an incredibly rare event. It was not the desperate act of a starving snake forced into an unusual meal. The cottonmouth was behaving exactly as it had evolved to behave. The Burmese python had simply become another item on its menu. When the researchers compared the footage with the X-rays they had already collected, the mystery became even more remarkable. One documented cottonmouth measured only about 34 to 42 inches long, Inside its stomach lay a Burmese python that was nearly the same length. The image looked almost impossible. One snake folded neatly inside another. The predator had swallowed prey approaching its own body length, pushing the limits of what biologists had previously believed was physically possible. Looking at the X-ray, one member of the team quietly described the discovery as watching evolution fight back in real time. Ian Bartoszek never celebrated. He did not see the discovery as a victory. Instead, he spent a long time studying that image because it represented something much larger than a single successful hunt. It revealed an ecological process no one had expected, a hunting strategy no researcher had thought to investigate. A native predator had been living in those wetlands all along, doing exactly what millions of years of evolution had prepared it to do, while scientists searched almost everywhere except the place where the answer had always existed. In many ways, the cottonmouth was the perfect predator for this job. Looking back, the evidence almost seemed obvious. The Florida cottonmouth, Archistrodon conanti, has long been one of the most underestimated predators in North America. Most adults measure between 30 and 48 inches, although exceptional individuals can exceed 6 feet. Their bodies are thick, muscular, and perfectly suited to life in flooded cypress forests, blackwater swamps, marshes, and drowned grasslands, the very landscapes that Burmese pythons had invaded. This had always been cottonmouth territory. The pythons were the newcomers,